How would you group or categorize the following four things into two groups? Science, religion, technology, and magic. Most people would categorize these things this way. They would group science and technology together, and group magic and religion together, because science and technology are empirical, while magic and religion are not empirical. This would be a methodological system of classification. Classification by method. Science and technology use the scientific method, while magic and religion do not. There may be some merit in this classification, but in his 1943 philosophy book, The Abolition of Man, C.S. Lewis proposes an alternative classification. He would suggest we instead put science together with religion, and invoke Arthur C. Clarke's rule that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. This would be a functional classification system. Classification by function, sorting not by means, but by ends, purposes, goals, functions. Not by how things work or don't work, but by what we use them for, why we want them. So, what functions do science and religion share that are different from the goals that technology and magic share? For the scientist and the theologian alike, the goal is to conform one's own ideas to an external, objective reality, while for both the engineer and the serious magician, the goal is to reshape the external reality to match one's own thoughts. The scientist and the theologian seek merely to understand, while the engineer and the magician seek to control. This connection between technology and magic has given rise to the term computer wizard. Lewis is not arguing that this is necessarily a bad thing in itself, as far as it goes. As I'm a computer science student, I'm a sort of engineer/magician myself. This means that I am not opposed to science. I think the practice of science would be improved by revealing its context through honest definitions of what it's all about, such as Lewis's ideas on philosophy of science provide. He vehemently denied that his essay was an attack on science. On a certain basic conceptual level, the goals of the engineer and the magician are fundamentally the same: to make your idea real, as opposed to making your idea match a pre-existing reality, as in pure science and theology. This is important because the changes we engineers introduce into the world can make things better, but they can also make things worse. The question is, how do we tell which changes are beneficial and which are harmful? This depends on what our ultimate goal, our end of ends, our summum bonum is. What, ultimately, are we doing all this for? Francis Bacon thought it was terribly naive to pursue scientific knowledge for its own sake. For him, the goal was an increase of human power over nature to the maximum extent possible, presumably until man has become the ultimate controller of all things. In short, Premise 1, power is good. Premise 2, knowledge is power. That's what Schoolhouse Rocky said, anyway. Conclusion, therefore, knowledge is good. Lewis argues that none of these statements always hold true. He characterizes himself as defending the value of knowledge, including scientific knowledge and science itself, because he is defending the idea of value. He argues that power in itself is neutral and can be used for good, but also for evil. Like Spider-Man's Uncle Ben said, "With great power comes great responsibility." Also, and more controversially, Lewis claims that applied knowledge does not always grant power to humanity. The European Enlightenment view of human progress, or man's conquest of nature, gives us a notion of man continually increasing in his powers over nature throughout history as the new ultimate goal of human life. This is how most people view man's collective history. But Lewis argues that there has never really been any net increase of man's collective power over nature, by arguing that every power won by man is actually the power of some men over other men. Real power is individualistic and exclusive, not collective and inclusive. By the way, the terms man and men are inclusive of all humans, not exclusive of women. To explain and support the view that real power is individualistic, he cites three powerful examples: the airplane, the wireless, for which we can substitute the internet, and the contraceptive. In the case of the airplane, if I pay you to carry me, I am not therefore myself a strong man. In the case of the internet, if I look up the answer on Wikipedia, I am not therefore myself a better educated man. Any of the three can be withheld from some men by other men, and therefore are not examples of increased power really belonging to the entire human species as a whole. It would appear that what we tend to call man's power over nature is really a power possessed by some men which they may or may not allow other men to profit by. Anyway, in regard to airplanes and the internet, Lewis says man is as much the patient or subject as the possessor, since he is the target both for bombs and for propaganda. But how do contraceptives constitute a power of some men over other men? First, Lewis is not coming out against contraceptives, or at least not against all forms of contraception, because he writes, "In a civilized community, anyone who can pay for them may use these things." He is only trying to get us to think about what using them really means, writing, "As regards contraceptives, there is a paradoxical negative sense in which all possible future generations are the patients or subjects of a power wielded by those already alive. By contraception, simply they are denied existence. By contraception used as a means of selective breeding, they are, without their concurring voice, made to be what one generation, for its own reasons, may choose to prefer." From this point of view, what we call man's power over nature turns out to be a power exercised by some men over other men, with nature as its instrument. The modern progressive society is embarked on a course of throwing everything possible into the goal of dramatically increasing the power of some men over other men. This is the real meaning of progress in progressivism. On the political level, this is made obvious in the power of the government over the people. But even more insidious is the power of the educational system over students and their parents. Even now, students are no longer taught to do good on the basis of timeless principles of right and wrong that are higher than any human institution. Instead, they are conditioned to contribute to society. Traditional ethics has been supplanted by utilitarianism, philosophy by psychology, reason itself by social justice, and truth by political correctness. To demonstrate what the results of this progressivism will be, Lewis asks us to imagine the human race extended in time from the first generation to the last one. In each generation, as some men's power over other men with nature as their instrument increases, that generation's control over all future generations increases. Because every power that one generation gains over the next is a power that the next generation loses, this means that eventually one lucky generation is reached which has the maximum influence upon its successors, while most successfully escaping the influence of its predecessors. The possessors of power in this one lucky generation Lewis calls the conditioners. Lewis imagined that this point could be reached by eugenics, by prenatal conditioning, and by an education and propaganda based on a perfect applied psychology. Clearly, new advances in technology, since Lewis, would give the conditioners many more weapons than even such a genius as Lewis could have imagined. After that point, the influences of each successive generation will necessarily decrease, because all the important decisions have already been made. The generations after the conditioners no longer have a significant power of choice, because scientific technique has been utilized to ensure their behavior will conform to the conditioner's expectations. Lewis says, "We may have put powerful machines in their hands, but we will have preordained how they are to use them. If the conditioning is good enough, then there will be no second revolt, and people will be stuck the way they have been conditioned forever, until the moon falls or the sun grows cold." Most objectors to progressivism typically follow the method of assuming that progressivist policies cannot succeed in accomplishing their goals, and arguing against them by deducing what the actual results of their failure will be, on the assumption that these results would be wrong. But Lewis takes a radically different approach in discussing progressivism. He assumes, for the sake of argument, that the progressives are right about all the facts, and that all their policies will work exactly the way they are expected and intended to work, and aims to show that the world in which progressivism works and succeeds is an inhuman world. His argument is not that the ultimate progressive society is wrong, but that it is inhuman. If such a society could be wrong, that would make it more human. The problem is that it's not wrong, because it has abolished the concepts of right and wrong, and in so doing has abolished humanity. In what Lewis calls the world of the Green Book, governed by the conditioners, it wouldn't make sense to the inhabitants of that world to speak of there being a wrong, because in such a world there could be no knowledge of wrongness. Lewis is not suggesting that the conditioners will be particularly bad men, but that they won't be men at all. He is saying that their abolition of the old ideas of value for the new conditioned arbitrary values will abolish man, because man's identity and essence is rooted in the old ideas of value. We will be able to have no common ground at all with either the conditioners or the conditioned, because the very idea of common ground that our civilization is rooted in is simply the old ideas of value and nothing else. This is not to say that we should not work to gain more scientific knowledge. It is only saying that we must remain aware of what our knowledge costs us, because there is no free lunch. We may be prepared to give up a great deal, but we must make sure that we do not give up our fundamental human values, because in that case, the value of our scientific knowledge itself falls with us. Some things should never be given up. Sometimes progress can be in the wrong direction, and progressing too far in what was once the right direction can undo itself. Lewis gives us a parable that progressivism is like an Irishman who found that a certain kind of stove reduced his fuel bill by half, and thence concluded that 2 stoves of the same kind would enable him to warm his house with no fuel at all. It is the magician's bargain. Give up our soul, get power in return. But once our souls, that is, ourselves, have been given up, the power thus conferred will not really belong to us. We shall in fact be the slaves and puppets of that to which we have given our souls. Lewis concludes, because we have to use numbers so much, we tend to think of every process as if it must be like the numeral series, where every step to all eternity is the same kind of step as the one before. There are progressions in which the last step is sui generis, incommensurable with the others, and in which to go the whole way is to undo all the labor of your previous journey. To reduce the Tao, the natural law, to a mere natural product is a step of that kind. Up to that point, the kind of explanation which explains things away may give us something, though at a heavy cost. But you cannot go on explaining away forever. You will find that you have explained explanation itself away. You cannot go on seeing through things forever. The whole point of seeing through something is to see something through it. It is good that the window should be transparent, because the street or garden beyond it is opaque. How if you saw through the garden too? It is no use trying to see through first principles. If you see through everything, then everything is transparent. But a wholly transparent world is an invisible world. To see through all things is the same as not to see.